So, good afternoon, everybody. On days like this, our minds undoubtedly wander to that one day about 10 years ago. I vividly remember how I, as a Dutch member of parliament, was attending a debate in the House plenary. Suddenly, my colleague, Ab Harrewijn, burst into the room to tell us that he had seen two planes flying into the Twin Towers on CNN. That whole day, I remained fixed in front of the television. Like so many of us, I could not believe what I saw. I realized that the world, as we knew, it had changed radically that day. Everyone felt the need to counter terrorism, but at what price? Apparently, for the US government and its allies, the end justified the means. In the years after 9/11, Oxfam Novib would experience the adverse consequences of the war on terror in its daily work through, first of all, blocking of bank accounts of local organizations. Secondly, limiting space for civil society through restrictive NGO laws. Thirdly, politicization of aid. And fourth, erosion of international human rights norms. But 9/11 affected the world in more ways. 9/11 radically changed our perspectives of the world. 9/11 increased the fear for the others who are amongst us, and for the others who wish to belong to our society, migrants. Globalization was no longer merely seen as an opportunity for free flows of information, trade, peoples, and ideas. Globalization was also considered a threat. Borders were strengthened and reinstated again, not only between nation states, but also increasingly within nation states, between the various cultural, ethnic, and religious groups inhabiting societies. But let me say this, not all perspectives changed for the worse. In response to the military approach to terrorism, what we saw, we see a wave of research into the root causes of terrorism. It raised questions about global injustice and poverty as a feedback for terrorism. In contrast with calls for a robust war on terror, stood pleas for the building of bridges between the Western and non-Western world. Next to state security, the concept of human security emerged that emphasizes the security needs of vulnerable citizens in terms of access to education, to healthcare, sustainable income, and freedom of movement and expression. As such, a new human perspective on combating the roots of terrorism emerged as well. Thus, the impact of 9/11 manifested itself in various ways. As a development and humanitarian organization, Oxfam Novib wants to reflect upon the impact this war has had on the work of human rights defenders, on the activities of civil society organizations, and on international norms. As a humanitarian and development organization, we are dedicated to fighting poverty and injustice around the world. For many years, we have been working in many countries with large Muslim communities, ranging from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, to Sudan, Somalia, Morocco, Egypt, and Palestinians in the Middle East. Oxfam Novib suddenly found itself in the midst of all these endeavors to counter terrorism. Depending on the perspective of counterterrorism, non-governmental organizations were either received as organizations that could be used as instrument to counter terrorism, or as an instrument of terrorism and therefore a threat. Both perspectives have impacted Oxfam Novib's work and the work of our partners. Let us start with the perspective of instrumentalization of NGOs and aid in general. The global war and terror brought renewed interest for the so-called fragile states, areas affected by recurring conflicts, weak governance, and extreme poverty. Suddenly, these forgotten conflicts received the attention of aid donors that Oxfam had already asked for so long. Once fragile states were identified as potential harbors for terrorists, they became a new focus in foreign policy making of Western governments. Sadly enough, new foreign policies predominantly pushed for military and security responses, even using aid for it. In February this year, Oxfam launched a report, Whose Aid Is It Anyway?, of which you can find hard copies on the side tables. The securitization of aid, as we say, threatens to undermine aid given on the basis of need. Since 2002, 1/3 of all development aid to the 48 states labeled fragile by the OECD has gone to just 3 countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Our guest speaker, Nuria Molina from Eurodat, will tell us more about the politicization of aid and its impact on aid flows. From the perspective of NGOs and aid as potential channels for terrorism, several counter-terrorism measures were directed towards local organizations. Oxfam Novib always worked primarily through local non-governmental organizations, seeking to empower marginalized people, to improve their livelihoods, and empower them to hold their own governments accountable. Suddenly, these civil society organizations were deemed suspicious, ignoring the presumption of innocence. One arm of counter-terrorist measures seeks to interdict financial flows to organizations that might support terrorism. The Somali Development Bank, for example, was put on the list of banned organizations by the US government. This led to much hardship amongst large sections of the Somali population who depend on financial support from their overseas families. Our guest speaker, OXNO Farah, from the Somali diaspora organization, HERDA, will tell us more about the consequences of these measures for the people in Somalia. Some national governments in the global south use the war on terror as a license to criminalize the opposition and clamp down on civil society. In Ethiopia, the government enacted an extremely restrictive new NGO law in order to silence opinion. The excuse for it was found in countering terrorism. The donor community, pushed by the USA, accepted that, as Ethiopia remained an important ally in the global war on terror. Another vivid example is Egypt. Late President Mubarak continued to receive support from the West despite his appalling human rights record and suppression of democracy. He was regarded by the US and its allies as a strong ally in the war on terror and effectively labeled all opposition and dissent as terrorist. And unfortunately, many more countries can serve as examples. But the suppression of civil society did not only affect organizations in the global south. Our guest speaker, Joris Thijssen, a Greenpeace activist, was arrested and detained for 3 weeks after he entered a gala related to the Copenhagen Climate Conference for a surprise action. Increasingly, civil society is seen as a threat, affecting our global norms and values. This brings us to a level of impact of the global war on terror that goes beyond our work and our partners. The global work on terror affected international human rights norms. Our keynote speaker, Mr. Sami El-Haj, has experienced, like no one else, how the war on terror eroded international human rights norms when he was captured while working as a journalist and held in Guantanamo Bay for more than 6 years. As Mr. El-Haj, we value freedom of expression and the crucial role journalism plays exposing power abuse and human rights violations. This makes it the more cynical that he, as a journalist, was detained illegally for so long. So we are very honored to have him today with us. Human rights and international law seem no longer inviolable in the Western world. One of our partners, the International Commission of Jurists, published an extensive report in 2009 about the effects of counterterrorism measure on human rights. The report states, "It is regrettable that during the last 8 years, many states have responded to terrorism in a manner that threatens the very core of international human rights framework. This represents perhaps one of the most serious challenges ever posed to the integrity of a system so carefully constructed after the Second World War." Our guest speaker, Professor Geert-Jan Knoops, will tell us more about the impact of the war on terror on international law. So, Changing Perspectives on a Post-9/11 World reads the subtitle of this Oxfam Novib Masterclass. This afternoon, we should not limit ourselves to identifying only the negative impacts of the global war on terror and how it changed the world. We should steer the future in a new direction. We can take inspiration from the Arab Spring and other clear signs of active citizenship. They show how courageous citizens worldwide share similar peaceful aspirations to build up their lives without fear for arbitrary governments and armed groups. Our challenge is to turn back the negative trends of the past decade and shape a more appealing second decade after 9/11, with human rights as an important positive instrument and not an obstacle to combat terrorism, as we saw in the first decade after 9/11. I therefore warmly invite you, as the future generation of policymakers, diplomats, and development workers, to envision the world as you want it to be on September 11, 2021. Enjoy the Oxfam Novib Masterclass.